And good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Jewish Destiny series with Rabbi Pinchas Landis. It is so great to see you all here tonight for our tour through Jewish history. We are picking up right where we left off last week. And I put in the chat box there, I will repost it now for anyone who, I don't know if people came in late, if they can access the messages from before. But here's our outline for tonight, if you would like to follow along with us. And we will be continuing our discussion. By the way, tonight we are just streaming on YouTube. We are not streaming on Facebook. That's just for tonight, and future episodes will be on Facebook as well. So if anyone tells you that they're beating down the gates trying to figure out where we are on Facebook, well, we're not on Facebook tonight. We're just on YouTube, Zoom, and this will be posted later on TorahAnytime.com, which is where you can find all of our lectures. And with no further ado, let's dive right into tonight's topic. So our topic for tonight is the struggle is real, Isaac and Ishmael. So if you recall from last week, we were discussing the life and times of Avraham Avinu, of Abraham, our forefather, the patriarch of the Jewish people, of his wife Sarah, the matriarch of the Jewish people, and really the beginning stages of what we call the proto-Jews. We asked the trivia question as to who is the very first Jew, and it's a very hard question to answer. And we labeled Abraham quite simply as the first proto-Jew. So that's where we're up to now, and we were knee-deep in the process, so to speak, of establishing the Jewish people, of building up the Jewish people, of really writing, so to speak, the DNA of the Jewish people. And in many ways, the struggle that we find during the life and times of Abraham, the life and times of Isaac, in many ways, it is a harbinger for what we have going on today. We've talked about the concept of Maisa Avos Siman Labanim, that the actions of our forefathers are a harbinger for future generations. And in many ways, what we will discuss tonight will help us to understand a lot of these struggles that are happening with us today. And by the way, when I say today, I don't just mean nowadays. I don't mean the big colloquial today. I'm sure you've all been following the news and know by today, I actually mean today. I didn't look at the most recent count, but as of sometime this morning, over 300 rockets had entered into the land of Israel, had hit the border cities, the southern border cities like Ashkelon and Ashdod, and sirens. Yes, the red alerts did go off in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, where my daughter is studying. So my daughter had her very first ever red alert, and I think that's the first red alert for our family. I don't think I was never in Israel during a red alert. My wife was never in Israel during a red alert, because when we were studying in Israel, studying in Jerusalem, respectively, the rockets from Gaza could not reach Jerusalem. Right? So we have to kind of realize what's going on over here, that the fact that rockets can now reach from Gaza to Jerusalem is an advancement, if you can use such a word, or a negative progression of the terrorism, of the Iranian support of Hamas and the weapons that they're getting, then now they have rockets that can reach as far as Yerushalayim, reach as far as Jerusalem. So it should give us all pause, and definitely a time for thought and introspection, and just trying to figure out what this all means to us. So, but as far as understanding the conflict, quite often a mistake that is made, and when I say a mistake that is made, I mean a mistake is made by politicians, is that politicians don't study history. Right? We know my favorite George Santayana quote that those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. And quite often, politicians try and look at a snapshot of what is in front of them and try and solve problems based on the information at hand, rarely looking deep enough into the history. One of the famous examples of this is the West's attempt to try and resolve the Iran-Iraq war that broke out after the Iranian Revolution. And quite often, there are many, are really across the board, politicians often looked at that as, okay, it's a conflict. There's a revolution. Now there's a conflict. There are border states, conflict, but not realizing that the Iranians and the Iraqis have been fighting for like 3,000 years, right? That's the Persians and the Babylonians. It goes way back. And if you don't understand the difference in culture, and you don't understand the difference in the histories and what's going on, these people, you can't understand it. It's a limited knowledge. So hopefully through our delving tonight in the life and times of Yitzchak Avinu, of Isaac, our forefather, his wife Rebecca, Rivka, and his half-brother Ishmael, we will hopefully come to a slightly better understanding of what we have in front of us today. So we mentioned before when we were talking about Avraham that the directive when he signed up for the task of being God's chosen nation, or to be the progenitor and the builder of God's chosen nation, it came with a blueprint, a map, a roadmap for the destiny that would play out in front of him. And that was the very first prophecy Abraham ever received, referred to as the Bris Bein HaBasarim, the covenant between the parts. And in that covenant, we mentioned last week that the Almighty says to Abraham, Yodua teda ki ger zarecha be'eretz lo lahem, that in order to be the type of people I want you to be, you had to be a stranger in a land that is not yours. And that was fulfilled by Abraham's life and times, just through the different comings and goings that he went through. And Isaac lives his whole entire life in the land of Israel. As far as we know, Isaac never leaves the borders of the land of Israel, but it still qualifies as being in a land that is not his, because he clearly doesn't have sovereignty. He clearly doesn't, so to speak, feel at home. And this is represented by a number of situations we are told. We're told how there were certain alliances that his father had made before him with the Philistines, and how, by the way, the Philistines are not the Palestinians. That's just in case you didn't know that, totally different people. The Palestinians of today have borrowed the name of the ancient Philistines. There's absolutely no connection whatsoever between the two peoples. We'll get to this more in depth later, but just to throw it out there. But the original Philistines, there were certain alliances made with Abraham, and we see they weren't honored in the time of Isaac. He had to redo all the alliances. So even though Isaac lived in our biblical homeland, and so to speak, the borders of what would become the land of Israel, he was clearly in an Eretz Lo Lahem. He was clearly in a land that did not belong to him. He felt like a stranger, and therefore it, so to speak, checked off in the check box being in exile, and his life counted for the 400 years in front of him. So that 400 years starts actually with the birth of Isaac, because the directive was your descendants. In other words, God was saying to Abraham, I need your descendants to be strangers in a land that's not theirs. So until Isaac, Abraham had no descendants, at least descendants that we're going to see were part of the progenitors of the Jewish people. So the 400 years can't start till then. And we're going to see that it is 400 years to the day, 400 years to the day that the Jews will leave Egypt. Isaac is born on the first day of Pesach, what would later be known as Pesach, and 400 years later to the day is when the Jews will leave, fulfilling the directive the Almighty gives to Abraham. Now, when we see Ishmael over here, and Ishmael was originally supposed to be one of the patriarchs. In other words, when Sarah gives her handmaid, who, as we mentioned before, handmaid is really a bad translation. It's more like right-hand woman. It's more like her main student. That's who Hagar was. When she gave Hagar over to Abraham, that was to try and create or procreate a progenitor for the Jewish people. And it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because of the attitudes and philosophies and actions of Ishmael as he starts to grow up. Now, a lot of this is not Ishmael on his own. It's Ishmael vis-a-vis his relationship to Isaac. In other words, Isaac is born. He is 14 years Ishmael's junior. He's born, Ishmael is 14 when Isaac is born. And right away, the Medrash tells us at the beginning of Isaac's life, there were what is called the Leitzei Hador, the scoffers of the generation, who would make fun of this old couple, because even though in biblical times people lived longer than they do today, it was unheard of for a 90-year-old woman and a 100-year-old man to be able to procreate and have a child. So, and not only that, but as a family who had been barren for all this time. So the scoffers of the generation used to poke fun at the situation, and they would say that Isaac is not really the son of Abraham. He's really the son of Avimelech, who was one of the kings that had kidnapped Sarah, because you see, Avram was with Sarah for whatever it was, 75 years, and she didn't become pregnant. And Avimelech was with her for one night, and shortly after she becomes pregnant. So the scoffers of the generation would question the legitimacy of Isaac as the heir to Abraham. Now, the Almighty, the Medrash tells us, tried to deal with this issue by making Isaac be essentially an identical twin of his father. As we see quite often, we know the progeny can look a lot like their parents, and that was definitely the case in Isaac. According to the Medrash, he looks exactly like Avram, to push away this statement of the scoffers that he wasn't legitimately Abraham's son. And we're told that was one of the big issues with Ishmael, that he was the leader of the scoffers. He would join in with the scoffers, and he would lead these questions on Yitzchak's yichus, on his lineage. Now, why would Ishmael do that? Quite obviously, because he was a threat to him, because he knew good and well that he was the son of a concubine, not the son of a full wife, and he knew full well that now that Abraham had a son from Sarah, that would diminish his role in the family. So he wanted to try and make sure that he had the most legitimate claim he could have to the estate of Abraham. So he started making up lies. By the way, this should sound very familiar, right? The descendants of Ishmael, we're going to see, love this plan, and it is carried out throughout history. And by the way, I'm not just saying this as a knock on the situation. I mean, it is a very negative issue in the present conflict, but really beyond that, there's the Arabs, the Arabic people, are known for their linguistics. They're known for their expressions. They're known for being a very expressive people. If you've ever read any Arabic literature, translated into English, but it comes like ancient Arabic literature, they're a very wordy, expressive people with beautiful prose and long metaphors, and that's how they speak. So, I heard a historian once referred to the 6 Day War, which we're now in the anniversary days of the 6 Day War. Yesterday was the anniversary of when Jerusalem was reconquered by the paratroopers, and on the first day of the war, for those of us who know the history, and if you don't, we'll get there eventually, but in a couple months or years or however long it's going to take us, but the Israeli Air Force in a daring sneak attack on the Egyptian Air Force were able to wipe out the entire Egyptian Air Force, or essentially the entire Egyptian Air Force. So this crippled the Egyptian Air Force on the first day of the war while they were all on the ground eating breakfast. And that essentially knocked Egypt out of the war. The ground war was insignificant after that. And that gave Israel the overwhelming advantage on the Western front, so to speak, against Egypt. Now, what does Nasser do? Nasser was the Egyptian emperor who provoked the whole war, the Egyptian dictator, president, whatever you want to call him. And he had alliances with all the Arab countries. And the most reluctant of his allies was King Hussein of Jordan. But nevertheless, he knew he had to work on his reluctant allies. So shortly after his air force is completely wiped out and he realizes he's about to lose the war, or he's basically lost the war before it even started, what's he do? He calls over to Jordan, right? Collect call to King Hussein. And he says, Husseini, guess what? We're bombing Tel Aviv. We've wiped out their capital. We've wiped out their biggest city. We're on our way to Jerusalem. We are winning this thing. You better get in now before it's all over so you can get some of the spoils and get some of the land for yourself. Jump in this thing. So King Hussein, sure enough, declared war on Israel, attacked, and that was a fatal mistake. They ended up losing all of the control of what we call Judea and Samaria, what they call the West Bank, what we call Yerushalayim, what they call also Jerusalem, I believe. I think they have another name for it. I'm just not recalling it this time. But but again, if you know how the Arabic culture is and how words are used, it's also, it was almost Hussein's fault for not understanding Nasser's words. You can't blame Nasser because he was speaking within the culture, and but Hussein missed it and attacked anyways, and that was a very fatal mistake for the Jordanians. But be it as it may, we see that this idea of delegitimizing claims is definitely Maisa Ovosim and Budim, is a actions of our forefathers being harbinger for present generations, because you see what Ishmael is really guilty of after Isaac is born, is delegitimizing the claim of Isaac to the estate, the spiritual estate and physical estate of Abraham, right? So Sarah says, we have to send them away. We have to send them away. Now, Avram doesn't want to, but Hashem says, listen to your wife. She knows better than you do. Send them away. And we're told a very interesting thing, that first of all, the issue was not only the scoffing, but as we said, it was the fact the scoffing was to delegitimize the claim of Isaac, to hopefully give him a stronger claim. The way that the Torah tells this to us is in reference to Ishmael. It says Kilo Yaresh, that Ishmael is not the inheritor, he is not the heir of the estate of Abraham. Kilo Yaresh. That's always been a phrase in rabbinical literature and just in Jewish thought and Jewish expression as to a core issue between Isaac and Ishmael, is this concept of Kilo Yaresh, that Isaac was the heir, is the heir, Ishmael not the heir, Kilo Yaresh. And I'll tell you actually a very moving story that in September 1970, for those of us who remember it, I don't. I was -8 years old at the time, and that was a time period known as Black September, when a offshoot of the PLO hijacked, I believe it was 4 or 5 aircrafts. They took them into Jordan because the Jordanians have to deal, in many ways, the PLO just like we do, and they landed the aircrafts at a deserted airport. They ended up detonating and exploding the aircrafts to show the world that they were serious. And in the end, the Jordanians intercede. They fought the offshoot Palestinians, and the conflict came to an end after about a month, shortly before Rosh Hashanah, or after several weeks, shortly before Rosh Hashanah, known as Black September. So one of the most famous hostages of the Black September crisis, he was on TWA flight 741 flying to Israel, was Rav Yitzchak Hutner. Rav Yitzchak Hutner was the dean of the famous Yeshivas Chaim Berlin in Brooklyn, New York. And beyond being the dean of that yeshiva, he's also known as one of the leaders of modern Jewish philosophy and Kabbalistic thought. He has a beautiful, almost poetic volumes of a work, several volumes of a work called Pachad Yitzchak, which is actually written by his daughter. His daughter was the one who wrote many of the volumes, edited other ones, but it's his philosophies. And he's known as being just one of the forefathers of modern Jewish philosophy. So Rabbi Hutner was one of the hostages. And seeing as they knew full well he was a rabbi, they took away his hat, they took away his yarmulke, they took away his shirt, they took away his tzitzis, and kept him in solitary confinement. I think it was 40 days or something around there, without a shirt, without a yarmulke, without his glasses, without, that's how he said. And he lost about 40 pounds during that roughly month that he was in solitary confinement at the hand of these terrorists. So eventually the Jordanians intercede, the hostages are let free, and Rav Hutner makes it back to New York on Erev Rosh Hashanah. Now, sure enough, the Jewish community was energized and brought to action when it came to praying for Rabbi Hutner's safe return. So sure enough, when he landed at Kennedy Airport, there's a whole tens of thousands of people got word that he was arriving, went to greet him. And someone who I'm very close with, Rabbi Ginsburg, Rav Aryeh Zev Ginsburg, Chaim Aryeh Zev Ginsburg, who was a part of our 10-step series, he was a young man at the time, and he was able to be at the front of the line with his father, who's a big rabbi, and he was right there when Rav Hutner got off the plane, and when Rav Hutner greeted Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was the halachic authority, the authority of Jewish law in America at that time, probably in the world. What were the first words out of Rav Hutner's mouth after going through such an experience? And just think for a minute, what would have been the first words out of your mouth after going through such an ordeal? Again, solitary confinement, being starved to the point where you lose 40 pounds, not being allowed to even have a shirt or tzitzis or glasses or anything. what would your first words have been? And no pejoratives, no, but the words that so Rav Hutner got off the plane and he embraced and gave Rav Moshe Feinstein, they embraced and gave each other a hug. And then Rav Hutner says in Yiddish, "Es brengt in them," which means it burns in them, their kilo yaresh, this concept that they were not the heirs of Abraham. In other words, he saw it like the point we're making now, that the whole conflict, the whole reason of this terrorist attack, the whole reason he was taken a hostage was because of this ancient struggle between Isaac and Ishmael, that Ishmael was delegitimized in the family, and therefore that is a conflict that reigns until our very day. And that's really what we're dealing with today in Israel. And when I mean today, like I said, I mean today with the bombings and what's going on. It all links back to the claim that they feel that they're the legitimate heirs of Abraham. They feel we have no legitimacy, and therefore that is the root of the whole conflict. Now, it's interesting. The Almighty knew all this, right? The Almighty is above time, is above space. Past, present, future, here and there is all the same when you're a non-physical, all-powerful, almighty God. So the Almighty knew this history that we've all experienced and a lot of the struggles that we've had with our big half-brother Ishmael. Now, the Torah paints a very interesting picture that at a certain point in their being driven away from the house of Abraham, Hagar and Ishmael don't have the provisions they need to survive. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough drink. And Hagar actually fears that Ishmael is going to, whatever the word would be, of dying from thirst. You say starve to death. We don't have food. I don't think we say thirst to death, but whatever. That was the mother's fear, was that her son was going to die of thirst. And she basically puts him down under a tree and says, it's all over. At that point, the Almighty makes a miracle. An angel comes, makes an oasis for water for them to drink, and says, don't worry, Hagar. Even though your son is not going to be the main heir of Abraham, he's still going to be a great nation. And sure enough, Ishmael has become a great nation in the world. I mean, 1/3 of the world is the descendants of Ishmael. But there's a very interesting lesson that comes out of that story, that the Torah tells us that at that point, the Almighty looked at the situation and judged Ishmael ba'asher hu sham, which means at the way he was at this moment. Now, Rashi and the commentators tell us that what does that mean? That means that the angels in heaven were interceding with the Almighty, saying, why would you let this Ishmael survive? We know what's going to play out. We know that he's going to be a tormentor of Isaac and Jacob, etc. We know he's going to cause the Jews a lot of trouble throughout history. Why in the world would you save him at this point? Says the Almighty that I judge a person ba'asher hu sham, in the way that they are at the moment. And for that reason, this is the Torah reading. This is one of the reasons that this is the Torah reading for one of the days of Rosh Hashanah, as if to say that message that we come on Rosh Hashanah and we get dressed up, and even if we don't go to synagogue all year long, we at least show up on Rosh Hashanah to hear the shofar and to eat the apple and the honey and to listen to the rabbi's beautiful sermon and whatever it is, and because at least on Rosh Hashanah we're going to be on our best behavior. Do we really think we're fooling the Almighty? No, but the Almighty judges us by Asher Usham. And I believe it was Dick Vitale who said that half the battle is just showing up or something like that, that is what Rosh Hashanah is all about. And that's why we read this in Rosh Hashanah to say that by Asher Usham, in the way we are in Rosh Hashanah, that's how we're going to get judged. And that's a lesson we take from Ishmael. Okay, it's interesting that when we talk about the life and times of Isaac, we know very, 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 very little. We're essentially told he's born and he, had this conflict with his brother. That's really with his parents, not with him. And then all of a sudden, we fast forward to the point where he is 37 years old. And the Almighty commands Abraham in his final test, right? The 10 tests of Abraham, this is the final test. And Abraham said, and the Almighty says to Abraham, Kach es bincha, take your son, as yichidecha, your only son, asher ahabta, that you love, Yitzchak, ala makom asher erka, into the place that I will show you, and bring him up as an offering, right? The famous binding of Isaac. And our sages tell us that at that moment in time, Abraham had every single question that you or I would have had in the moment. I mean, think about it for a moment. Abraham is 137 years old at the time, right? 137 years old. He's been preaching monotheism for almost a century at this point, for about 80 years at this point. The Almighty's spoken to him. He's been the Almighty's prophet. He's continued to teach these ideas of monotheism. And one of the main ideas of monotheism and going against the culture of the times of polytheism was going against this concept of human sacrifice and the idea of sacrificing children, like was so common amongst the polytheistic cultures, especially at that time. And that was one of the things that Abraham railed against. That was one of the things that Abraham regularly said, we don't do, God doesn't want, God doesn't expect from us. It was one of his main mantras, one of his main messages to the people. And here, and the end of it all, but again, Abraham doesn't know this is the end, but in the 10th test that he gets from the Almighty says, "Oh, I told you all along, don't perform a human sacrifice. Well, you know what? Let's take Isaac up to the place I will show you and bring him on the altar." Now, one of the reasons we refer to this as the binding of Isaac and not the sacrifice of Isaac is because I think we're all familiar with the end of the story that Isaac doesn't actually get sacrificed. In the end, the angel stops him, but by the simple fact that Abraham had such a trust in the Almighty, was so close to the Almighty that he was, even though he had every question you and I would have at that point, nothing made sense. His whole life's work at that point was, so to speak, in question. Still, he went forward with it without delay and was willing to do exactly what the Almighty commanded of him. Now, it is interesting that we actually learn a fascinating lesson on the importance of speech from the way that the Almighty communicates to Abraham and the way that Abraham subsequently communicates to Isaac. Because if you look at the verses in the Torah that describes the story, at no point does the Almighty tell Abraham that he's going to kill Isaac, right? He says, bring him. He says, Ulech lecha el haaretz haMoriah, go to the land of Moriah. Ve'elehu sham la'olam, bring him up as an elevated offering. Al echad heharim asher omer elecha, on one of the mountains that I will show you. So bring him as an elevated offering. Well, what we're going to see is the very bringing of Isaac and tying him up was the elevated offering. And in many ways, that's how we look at Yitzchak. That's how we look at Isaac, that he is that perfect offering. He is that perfect specimen of someone who aims to have a relationship with the Almighty, willing to put it on the line. And even the Kabbalistic works go as far as to say that even though Isaac wasn't killed at the time of the binding of Isaac, it was as if he was killed and as if his soul went to heaven. And, they get into all kinds of Kabbalistic things over here. But be it as it may, this was that one valiant final act, one final test of Abraham to show that, so to speak, he really meant it, that no matter what the Almighty told him to do, even if he didn't understand it, even if he had all the questions that you and I would have and then some, still the Almighty had enough credit, so to speak, in his eyes, and it built up a big enough bank account in his eyes that he would go forward with the action that he completely did not understand. Now, just an interesting lesson that comes out of the story is that at the time of the binding of Isaac, Isaac is referred to as a nar, which means a little boy in Hebrew. It's a term for a little boy. And we're going to see the term used in a few parshas later on in the Torah by Isaac's grandson, Yosef. Joseph is going to be referred to as a nar, as a little boy. When Joseph is introduced to us as a little boy, he is 17 years old. And all the commentators ask the question over there, why in the world is Isaac being referred to as is Joseph being referred to as a little boy if he's 17 years old? Everyone knows a 17-year-old is not a little boy. So why in the world does the Torah refer to Joseph as a little boy? And they all give answers as to, even though he was 17, he acted immature, he needed to grow up a lot, as we see by his way of dealing with his brothers. Okay, we'll get to that soon. Over here, Isaac is also called a little boy at the time of the Akedah Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. But as we wrote here in the outline, Isaac at this point is 37 years old. So he's 20 years older then his grandson will be when he's called a little boy. Yet for some reason over here, none of the commentators asked the question. No one asked the question, why is it that the 37-year-old Isaac is being referred to as a little boy? Except for the Rebbeinu Bechaya. What does the Rebbeinu Bechaya say? Pointing out this seemingly contradiction or conundrum, or whatever you want to call it, that here everyone's bothered by Joseph being called a little boy when he's 17, but no one seems to be bothered by Isaac being called a little boy when he's 37. So Rebbeinu Bechaya says it's simple. He says that anytime a son is with a father, no matter how old he is always a little boy. So here, even though Isaac was 37, Abraham was 137, he was a little boy. Even though he was a full-grown man, he was a little boy because he was going with his father. Again, very telling lesson on how we look at things in life experience and life lessons. So, okay, we're going to pause now for station identification and for any questions that might have popped up so far. And I will look first to the chat box, see if I missed anything. Okay, were there innocents like Sarah? When you say innocence like Sarah, you mean that how we see that Sarah was very pure when she passed away? Was there anyone who's as pure as her? Is that your question, Deanne? I'm not sure I follow what you're asking. So if you want to clarify that. In the meantime, are there? Yeah. So I don't know if there was anyone else. Maybe Rivka, maybe Rachel and Leah were on the same level. I don't know beyond that if there was anyone. I'm not sure. Any other questions before we continue on from the peanut gallery? Go ahead, Joanne. See your hands raised over there.
What was the term you said for judging people on how they are at the moment? What was the Hebrew?
Yeah, so it's Ba'asher Husham. So if you have the outline and you look at 2B22, right? Or towards the top of the outline, it's there in the Hebrew. I have it there with the actual Hebrew. Ba'asher Husham, which means the way they are.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before we continue? Okay. Again, as always, you can hold your questions till the end and either put them in the chat box and I'll see them when we get there, or you can save them on your own at the end. Okay. So the binding of Isaac happens. That, so to speak, proves Abraham's place as the first of our patriarchs. It proves Isaac's place as the second of our patriarchs, and that's what we know essentially about Isaac's life. Okay, he's going to get married and have kids, but that's about all we know. We don't know much more. Now, Sarah, after the Akedas Yitzchak, she hears about the binding of Isaac, and our sages tell us that when the message was given to her, somebody said, Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac and he didn't kill him, right? He wanted to tell the story. But once Sarah hears those words, she drops dead out of absolute concern for her son. Now, that's not to say that this was before Sarah's, so to speak, time to go. She was 127 years, we're told. And as Deanne pointed out, we're told that she's 127 in a funny way. It says that she is Mea Shana ve'esrim Shana ve'shiva Shanim, that she was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years, which sounds like a funny way to do it. So Rashi tells us right away that when she was 100, she was as pure as when she was 20, and when she was as 20, she was as pure and beautiful as when she was 7. As if to say that when she was 127, she had a completely clean slate like a young child. And that's the type of woman that Sarah was. Now, this is really, one of those, as one of my teachers, Rav Shai Klinman, Zichron Livracha, used to say that a coincidence is just a miracle when the Almighty chooses to remain anonymous. Here's our coincidence/miracle for the night, because we're going to discuss now the concept of Hebron, the concept of the city of Hebron, and when it became a holy city to the Jewish people. And I'll tell you in a minute why that's so serendipitous for today. And if you follow today in Jewish history, you already know why. But if you don't, then you'll know it in a moment. So it comes time to bury Sarah. And Abraham says, I need to bury her in the best possible place. I want to bury her in the same place where Adam and Eve are buried. And that is in an area known as Kiryas Arba, which means the town of the four. One of the reasons it's called the town of the four is because there were four great couples that were destined to be buried there. The first was the first was Adam and Eve. Second is Abraham and Sarah. Second is Isaac and Rebekah, and third is Jacob and Leah. And Abraham knows through his prophetic intuition that this is the cave where Adam and Eve are buried, and he says that's where we need to be buried as well. So he goes through a whole process of purchasing the field from a person named Ephron, and he purchased it for what was an exorbitant price in those days, but he wanted to, so to speak, make it clear beyond any shadow of a doubt that this was his place. This was his ancestral burial place. It would always be his burial place. It would always be in the hands of his family. And we see because of that Hebron has been undisputed as a Jewish city from that point forward in history. Not, right? That we see that Abraham tried quite hard to make sure that it would be, but obviously the city has come under much conflict in many different conflicts throughout history. But that is when Hebron becomes a holy city, because it is where the patriarchs and the matriarchs are buried. Now, I'll tell you a fascinating story just connecting to today and the city of Hebron, that yesterday, as we mentioned, is known as Yom Yerushalayim. It's the day when the Israeli Defense Force conquered the old city of Jerusalem. It was the first time that we as a Jewish people had sovereignty over the city of Jerusalem in almost 2,000 years, since the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, or at least since the Bar Kokhba revolt, so 1,800 years, we'll say. That's Yom Yerushalayim. So I always say that if yesterday was Yom Yerushalayim, that means today is Yom Hebron. Why? Because what happens after the Jews conquer Yerushalayim? After the IDF conquers Yerushalayim, well, they get back in their Jeeps and they head south about, I don't know, it's probably about a half an hour or so to conquer Hebron. Now, Rabbi Goren was the chief rabbi of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force at that time. And he was there at the moment when the old city was conquered. He's the one who famously said at the time, they heard him over the radio, you can hear him today if you Google it, Har Habayis B'Yadenu, Har Habayit B'Yadenu, that the Temple Mount is in our hands. And just like he did not miss the auspicious moment of Jerusalem being recaptured, he did not want to miss the same equally significant moment of Hebron being captured, because we talk about in Jewish philosophy that there's four holy cities in Israel, and one is Jerusalem and one is Hebron. The other two are Tiberias and Sfat. They come onto the map later in history, but he wanted to be there for the conquering of Hebron. So he goes with the soldiers south. He camps out with them the night before, and he tells the soldiers, he says, no matter what, and none of them had slept in a couple of days at this point, so no matter what, wake me up in the morning. I want to be there when we enter Hebron. So what did these soldiers do, who had a little bit of Rahmanas, a little bit of mercy on the old rabbi, and they knew how exhausted they were themselves? They let him sleep in. The rabbi wakes up, notices he was left behind, jumps in his Jeep, and heads to Hebron. When he gets to the city, he finds the whole city of several thousand Arabs draped in white sheets and white flags, as if they were, in a mode of surrender. So he says, oh, they beat me here and the battle's already done and the Arabs have already surrendered. Great. So what does he do? He heads straight for the Maras HaMachpelah. He heads straight for the Cave of the Patriarchs. Now, at this point in time, the building, in other words, there were many points in time where the building was used both as a mosque and as a synagogue, as it is today, by the way. Now, why is that? That's because now there's no dispute as to who's buried there. Both we and the Arabs, both we and the Muslims say it's Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Leah, and Adam and Eve. Right, we agree on that with our Muslim cousins, but the family of Ishmael has holy stature in Islam, just like in Judaism. So it's part of the Quran, it's part of their Bible, and that's why the Cave of the Patriarchs is holy, is a holy site in Islam, and they pray there. And so too, that's why the tomb of Rachel, Cave of Rachel, as we call it, also is a holy site, or not anymore because it was just a little bit too intense of a situation. But that's why there's claims of it being a holy spot to the Arabs as well as to the Jews, because Rachel was the cousin of, it was the half cousin, I guess, right? It'd be the half cousin of Ishmael. So so because of this, there were times where we had a good relationship with our Muslim cousins, and both Jews and Arabs and Jews and Muslims would pray there. But that had not been the case in 700 years. So when Rabbi Goren gets to the Cave of the Patriarchs, the doors leading into the synagogue section are soldered shut. He takes out his Uzi and starts shooting at the door, trying to get it open. He couldn't get it open. So then he takes a chain from his Jeep, is able to tie it to the doors of the synagogue, drives to yank open the doors yank open. Just as that happens, the IDF comes in over the hill. What happened? Rabbi Goren thought they had come and gone. No, they haven't even arrived yet. They were just outside the city in a different direction than Rabbi Goren had arrived, planning their attack. So Rabbi Goren essentially single-handedly conquers the city of Hebron while the IDF is left waiting or planning out their strategy. But as we saw, there wasn't much conquering to be done because the Arab residents had already surrendered the city. So Rabbi Goren goes in to pray in the Cave of the Patriarchs. An Israeli flag is hoisted over the Herodian building. There's a beautiful building over the Cave of the Patriarchs that was built by Herod, who we'll definitely talk plenty more about. And he hoists up an Israeli flag. I'll give you a picture of that momentarily here. And as that was happening, Moshe Dayan, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Israel, the head of the Israeli army, calls or radios in and says to a command to Rabbi Goren saying, get down, get that flag down from there and take off your shoes because you're inside of you're inside of a mosque. And Muslims don't pray with shoes on. And that's the respectful behavior that the Muslims have in their mosque. By the way, we have the exact opposite in our synagogues. A Jew is supposed to always pray with shoes on, but it's the exact opposite for our Muslim cousins. So Rabbi so Moshe Dayan says to Rabbi Goren, he says, get your shoes off and get that Israeli flag down. And, we don't want to start World War III over here. Now, by the way, Moshe Dayan said the same thing the day before on what became known as Yom Yerushalayim, because the soldiers initially hoist an Israeli flag up over the Dome of the Rock. Moshe Dayan looking on from the Mountain of Olives with binoculars, it says, get that flag out of there, right? Because he felt that would really, really exacerbate the conflict in a direction that he wasn't willing to take it. So in Jerusalem, they listened, but in Hebron, Rabbi Goren didn't. Rabbi Goren refused. Here's the picture of him hoisting the flag on top of the Cave of the Patriarchs. And Rabbi Goren refused to listen to orders from the top officer of the Israeli army. So what does Moshe Dayan do? He radios to whoever the superior officer, the ranking officer was at Hebron at that time. He tells him to yank down the flag off the top of the Cave of the Patriarchs and to come back to Jerusalem at once. So sure enough, the soldier takes on the flag, and on the way back to Jerusalem, there's a friendly fire car accident, and the soldier dies. So Moshe Dayan took that as a sign from heaven that Maris Machpelah, the Cave of the Patriarchs, was meant to be, in fact, not just a mosque anymore, but also be a synagogue. And until this very day, the Cave of the Patriarchs has been a synagogue and a mosque, because unlike what our Muslim cousins did after the 48 war, right? After the 48 war, part of the armistice agreement was that the Jews were supposed to have free passage into the old city to pray at the Kotel. And how many Jews were allowed to pray at the Kotel from 1948 to 1967? Zero, right? Even though the armistice agreement said it was supposed to happen, international law said it was supposed to happen. The UN troops were supposed to be making sure that happened. Never happened. Not only that, but in their true desire to preserve culture and their true respect for the culture of others, the Arabs in the old city of Jerusalem blew up every single synagogue in the old city in 1948, leaving the city, or at least the Jewish core of the city, in ruins to be repaired after 1967. Okay, but we don't deal with it like that. We've left the Dome of the Rock as a holy site for the Muslims, and we share the space of the Maris Machpelah with our Muslim cousins to be able to have, hopefully, one day a peaceful situation. So that's the Cave of the Patriarchs, and we'll see that this is where Isaac and Rebekah are buried, as well as Jacob and Leah. Okay, now, at this point, we have Sarah's gone, and Avram says, okay, now it is time to replace, so to speak, or try to replace Sarah as the matriarch. And he says, it's time for my son, who's now 37 years old, or now actually 40 years old by the time it happens. It's time for him to get married. So he sends his trusty steward of his house, the head of his household, Eliezer, who we know is Eliezer Eved Avraham, which means Eliezer, the servant of Avraham. He sends Eliezer on a mission to find a wife for Isaac. Now, he didn't want Isaac to marry the Canaanites, of which they were living, amongst whom they were living. He said he wanted Isaac to only marry back to his family. If you remember last week, we talked about how the development of the Jewish people in many ways is filtering out that family of Abraham, taking what was good from his siblings, and therefore Abraham sends Eliezer back to Bethuel, to his uncle, to find a wife for his daughter. And this was very hard for Eliezer, because Eliezer was hoping, first of all, until Ishmael was born, until Isaac was born, he was assuming he would be the heir of the estate. And so he was obviously knocked off as that. So if he couldn't be the heir of the estate, he at least wanted his daughter to marry Isaac. And now he saw that wasn't going to happen. But we see, in the way of a faithful servant, he continues on to go to make the shidduch, make the match between Rivka and Isaac. Dealing with Bethuel, dealing with Lavan, who we're going to meet a little bit too much in these next few weeks. And he brings Rivka back to marry Isaac. Now, there's a fascinating medrash that tells us that Eliezer had another name besides just Eliezer, and that is that he was Og, king of Bashan. Now, who is Og, king of Bashan? Og, king of Bashan is someone who appears later in the Torah, and in the Midrashim, he already appeared earlier. And but he is basically a tormentor of the Jewish people, a tormentor of Moses. According to some Midrashim, he was already a tormentor of Abraham. And according to this Medrash, we see that after Abraham and Og's first encounter, which we didn't really touch on last week, but there was a Medrash tells of an earlier encounter, that Abraham, like he did to everybody, he reached out to him, he made him a monotheist, he became the steward of his house, right? That's what happened. But we see after this moment, once he realizes he's not going to be part of the family, he's not going to be able to marry in, he's not going to be there, he also, like Ishmael, leaves the fold and becomes Og Melech HaBashan, becomes Og the king of Bashan, who we'll see torments the Jewish people tremendously later on at the time of Moses. So fascinating medrash. One medrash that says it, but it is fascinating nonetheless. Now, Rivka and Yitzchak have a very different marriage than Avram and Sarah. So Avram and Sarah, first of all, they grew up together. They were the same family. Sarah was his niece, and they knew each other their whole lives. They were high school sweethearts, whatever it was. They went to the prom together. They became religious together. They had a very harmonious relationship in many ways. We see that Sarah had the ability to question Abraham, and Sarah often, like every good wife, won those arguments, and like every good husband, Abraham listened to his wife. And so we see, that's the relationship that Avram and Sarah had. But Rebecca and Isaac have a much different relationship. And it is really represented by their very first interaction, that we're told that the first time Rebecca actually sees Isaac, that he's praying in the field. It's the first time, according to the Medrash, that the Mincha service, the afternoon service, was ever prayed. And she sees him, and she sees this holy man that's going to be her husband, and she falls off her horse. Like, she's like, covers her face, and there's always this disconnect between Isaac and Rebecca, because of, in many ways, Isaac is like an angel after the binding of Isaac, and there just seems to be a total disconnect. And this is part of what we'll see when we get to next week, the whole story with the blessing. Actually, I have it on the outline for today. We'll see if we have time for it. But this could be the disconnect that comes with the blessings of their children and that whole situation. But there's really just this disconnect between, in many ways, Isaac and Rebecca. So the little that we know about their marriage is that is the tone in many ways. Now, Rebecca, like Sarah before her, was barren for 20 years. The first 20 years of her marriage, the first 20 years of their marriage, she cannot have children, she cannot conceive. And finally, after 20 years, she becomes pregnant. Now, The verse shows us or tells us something very interesting after she becomes pregnant. And it tells us that it says that the children were agitating inside of her stomach. The Tomer, and she said in response to this, if this is the case, like, what do I need this for? In other words, if I'm going to have such birth pangs and pregnancy is going to be so difficult, like, what do I need it for anyways? Put yourself in Rebecca's shoes for a moment. Here, she's been barren for 20 years. Finally, she's praying, her husband's praying, hoping that they're going to have children, being told they're going to have children, and not, 20 years of the struggle. Finally, she becomes pregnant, and she feels some birth pangs, and she says, whoa, this is what pregnancy is all about. Like, what do I need it for? What do I need to live for? What is going on here? So, as always, we have the Midrashim to fill in the pieces. And the Midrashim tell us that this was back in the days, believe it or not, before ultrasounds. At this point, Rebecca did not know that she was pregnant with twins. She just knew she was pregnant. And when she would walk past a house of monotheistic thought and study, she'd feel the baby trying to get out. And when she would walk past a house of idol worship, she again would feel what she thought was the same baby trying to get out. And she said, if this is the type of kid I'm going to have, if I'm going to have a kid who's conflicted between monotheism and polytheism, if I'm going to have a kid who's not going to know the truth of the Almighty and actually be tempted by the polytheistic temptations in this world, what do I need? I don't want such a kid. Now, even though there weren't ultrasounds, they had the next best thing in that day. They had prophets. So she goes to the great prophet of Shem and Aver to ask, like, what is going on over here with this kid? And they say, don't worry, it's not one kid. It's two kids, and one is going to be drawn towards and fight evil. One is going to be drawn towards good, and Shalom al Yisrael, right? All is good. So, thank God, right? What do you mean, thank God? A minute ago, you thought you were going to have one conflicted kid. Now you realize you're going to have a Jacob and an Esau? You realize you're going to have a Yaakov and an Esau? You're okay with this? She said, yeah. Because when I thought I was going to have a conflicted kid, that's the worst thing in the world. Being conflicted and having that ill ability to discern between right and wrong, that I don't need. But that I have a kid that chooses right, that chooses wrong, okay. At least they've chosen sides over here. That I can take. But I can't have that conflict. And in truth, these are the same words that are echoed by Eliyahu Hanavi, by Elijah the prophet on Mount Carmel when he's talking, when he's in his great showdown, which we'll get to in a few weeks, his great showdown with the priests of Baal, that his whole complaint to the Jewish people is Ad Masai Poskin al Shnei Seifim, until when are you going to straddle the fence? Im Hashem Elokim Elokav L'chu Acharav. If Hashem's your God, go with Hashem. V'im Baal L'chu Acharav. And if you believe in the idols of Baal, go with them. What? This is Elijah the prophet telling the Jewish people to go worship the idols of Baal if they want to? No, because the Jews at that time, it wasn't they just worshipped idols. They were also conflicted, right? They would go to shul on Shabbos and to the temple of Baal on Sunday. They were Jews for Getchkalach over here. They were Jews for idols, right? The original Jews for Baal. That's what they were. And Eliyahu said, that's not okay. Choose a side. You want to be evil? Be evil. You want to be good? Be good. But don't hedge your bets. Hedging doesn't work. And don't even try it. And that lesson was coming down from Rebecca. That she was saying that if I have a kid who's going to hedge, I don't want it. Oh, but I have two kids, one, okay, at least they chose a side. And initially, the grand plan, so to speak, is that Jacob and Esau are supposed to be partners. They're supposed to be partners. There's a verse in the Psalms by King David which says, "Sur me'ra v'aseh tov, bakeh shalom v'radfehu," that you're supposed to remove the evil, do good, seek out peace, and run after it. And this is defined by some commentaries as what the relationship between Jacob and Esau was supposed to be. In other words, Esau was drawn towards evil, but he could have fought it. And maybe that draw towards evil was a draw to destroy the evil. And therefore, his role was supposed to be the Sur Me'ra, the one who's going to withdraw, to destroy the evil in the world. And then Jacob, he would be the Asay Tov. He'd be the one, as we see that he was Ish Tam Yoshev Olim. He was the simple man, not simple in a simplistic way, but simple in a pure way. The simple man who sat and studied in the study halls. So that was supposed to be the relationship. Esau was supposed to, as the warrior, as we see, he was the warrior. He was supposed to fight the evil, destroy the evil. And then Jacob would go in and instill the good once the evil was destroyed. But we see that quite often what happens when someone's job is to destroy evil, that means they have to be involved with the evil and the evil can overtake them. And that's what happens with Esau. In many ways, I always like to bring those wonderful lessons from the great theologian of our generation, George Lucas, in one of these Star Wars prequels, that this is very similar to what we saw with Anakin Skywalker when he went over to the dark side, right? His job was to watch out for the dark side, was to keep an eye on Palpatine. And here he ended up being overcome by that connection to evil, and for many years was Darth Vader, until in the end he rectified and killed Palpatine and became Anakin Skywalker again. I'm sorry if you haven't seen the movies, I'm spoiling it, but if you're into Star Wars, you know what I'm talking about. But this is the situation over here, that it was supposed to be a partnership, but Esau failed and went to the dark side. Now, okay, chronologically, the day that Avraham dies, so Avram's alive to see grandchildren, to see Jacob and Esau be born, and the whole time Avram is alive, Esau has not gone off the derech yet. He has not left the fold. He has not become the person who's running after evil. But we understand that he has his first defying acts the day of Abraham's funeral. In fact, when he comes in, we in the famous story of Jacob cooking the red lentils and Esau saying, give me that red stuff, and he gives it to him, he sells him the birthright. So what was lentils? Lentils are round. They're that's where one of the customs comes from, that when someone passes away, we eat round foods to show the circle of life. And that Jacob was making this food for his father, because his father was coming back from the funeral of Abraham. So we say that as long as Abraham was alive, Esau didn't go off. But on the day that he died, on that day, he went off and did every terrible thing he could possibly do. Now, it's interesting that at Abraham's funeral, the Torah tells us that the two sons of Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael, go to bury Abraham. And the Torah tells us that Ishmael allowed Isaac to walk in front of him. That the Torah tells us that Ishmael let Isaac walk first, as if to say that after all this, he finally agreed that Isaac was the progenitor of Abraham, the one who was going to inherit, the one who was going to be the heir of Abraham. And we understand from that act that Ishmael did tshuva, that Ishmael fully repented, that he fully came back, that he was with Isaac. He was on Team Isaac at that point, and fine with the fact that he would not be the heir, but they were still had a familial connection. And we understand it from that point. This is what the commentaries tell us. And that was for many years, for many centuries even, that was really the relationship between the Jewish people and Ishmael, or Isaac and Ishmael, if you will, that Ishmael was looked at as one of our cousins. And the proof is in the pudding. How so? Because we see after this point in time, until a specific latter date, that Jews are given the name Ishmael. We have many men in Tanakh later on in the prophets whose names are Ishmael. One of the soldiers of I think it's Yoshaphat has a soldier. One of his chieftains, his name is Ishmael. We see that there's an heir to the throne of King David after the destruction of the temple, whose name is Yishmael ben Netanyahu. There's definitely something to say about that name. I just haven't figured it out yet. But Ishmael ben Netanyahu, who's actually the one who kills Gedaliah ben Achikam, we'll get to that story later. And not only that, but one of the famous rabbis of the Talmud is Rebbe Yishmael. So you see here for many generations that Jewish mothers named their sons Ishmael. And if Ishmael was evil, they weren't naming their sons Esav, right? If Ishmael was evil, that would never have happened. So we can also deduce from here that the tradition of Ishmael doing tshuva was one that goes back, that was respected. That was our relationship to our Arab cousins from time immemorial until a certain point in time. And that point in time was the 7th century with the rise of Islam. And we're going to see that's going to alter the relationship. But really, from this point in history, from roughly the 16th century BCE until the 7th century CE, so 23 centuries, if you will, we have a benevolent relationship with Ishmael. We have a benevolent relationship with the Arabs. We live amongst them in peace. And by the way, spoiler alert for when we get to the 7th century, after the Islam, the conquest of Islam, we also have a pretty decent relationship with the Muslims. And as a matter of fact, from throughout antiquity, we have a significantly better relationship with the Muslims than we do with the Christians. The fact that nowadays we have a benevolent relationship with our Christian cousins and we have a rocky relationship with our Muslim cousins, that's only about 100 years old, right? Or maybe even the good relationship with the Christians is 70 years old, maybe, if we want to give it that long. But that's a snapshot in history. For centuries before that, for 2,000 years before that, we had a terrible relationship with the Christians, and we usually had a pretty decent relationship with Ishmael. So this is a very important point to keep in mind from our discussion tonight. If you only take one lesson, I hope it's this. It's that the conflict of today, that we see literally today, going on in Israel today, this is a recent phenomenon. This is a recent phenomenon that is a result of the Muslims importing the Christian anti-Semitism or taking it from the Christians. It's a result of the Treaty of Versailles, that we'll get to that and see how the debacle of the Treaty of Versailles leads to a lot of these negative sentiments. And it's a recent problem. And just like when we have like we were talking about before, when conflicts go back generations, it's very hard to untangle them and very hard to resolve them. But when a conflict only goes back a short period of time, it's much easier to resolve. So even though, now this might be the optimistic Pinchas Landis talking, but even though when we look at the Arab-Israeli conflict, it looks unsolvable. Again, if you had told me 15 years ago we'd have a peace treaty with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, with Sudan, I would have told you you're crazy. But be it as it may, it might look unsolvable without Mashiach, anything short of the Messianic era. But when we keep in mind that this is a short-lived problem, this is a recent problem, a recent phenomenon of our struggle with Ishmael, hopefully that can give us comfort to know that just like it's not a ingrained centuries-old problem, that it can too be eliminated, pacified, like we did with the Christians. Because with the Christians, we had a 1900-year struggle, or at least a 1800-year-old struggle. That was a very bloody struggle, much bloodier than anything that we've had at the hands of the Muslims thus far. And but you see, there was a reconciliation eventually, and now we, thank God, have a wonderful relationship for the most part with our Christian cousins. So I think that's an important piece to take in mind, to keep in mind from this. Okay, I'm not going to go into the blessings tonight, even though it's on our outline, because it's a little too involved. But we'll start with that. Not next week. Next Tuesday, a week from tonight, is the second day of Shavuos. So there will not be a class next Tuesday night. But in 2 weeks from tonight, we'll continue with talking about Jacob, Esau, and the development of the nation of the Jewish people. And I look forward to it. So before we wrap up, I'm going to jump in here to see if we have any other questions that we would need to be addressed. Were Isaac and Joseph called Nar because they were innocently? No, Deanne. So Joseph is called Nar because he's immature. Because he has an immaturity that he has to uncover. That's what we're going to see, and probably about 2 classes from now. Whereas Isaac, it's, as we said, it's because he's with his father. And as long as his son is with his father, he's always a little boy. Okay, let's see. Joanne shared a few things here. These are pictures, Joanne. Is that what I'm looking at? Are these?
Nomi sent the pictures to me. She answered my question.
Oh, got it. Okay, cool.
Because I wasn't sure how to spell something.
Yeah, that's why we have our wonderful committee of Nomi here running the show for us. Okay, that's it from the chat box. Any other questions from the floor? Brian, it's good to see you. It's been a while. It's great to have you here. It's great to have everyone here. Ari, we haven't seen in a while. Can
I make a quick community announcement?
By all means, take the floor, Joanne.
Thank you. So Federation is going to be is organizing a rally tomorrow for Israel. We're starting at the Malt Museum at 5 o'clock. Then everybody is going to walk over to the Federation parking lot for a rally. So it'll be 5 to 6, meet at the Malt, and then we'll walk over to Federation. And please spread the word to everybody.
It's interesting. This is when we moved to Cleveland, which was almost 7 years ago to the day. It was the end of June, but close enough. That was when the last big flare up happened, and I remember there was a rally at the same place, JCC, and here we are again. But again, my words of hope from tonight that I really hope will stick with everyone. That even though this is all we've known, right? This is all we've known of the era of the Jewish or the relationship with Ishmael. I hope that we'll keep in mind that it's not from time immemorial. It's not ancient. And in many points in antiquity, we had a anywhere from a decent to a wonderful relationship with Muslims. And hopefully we can look at what we've seen from the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan as paving the way for more. So that should really be our hope and prayer at this point. Either that or Mashiach, right? Because one way or the other it'll resolve the situation. But let's hope and pray that we do see better days, and that the relationship that hopefully we can have Mashiach, but anything short of Mashiach, we can see the relationship get back to where it was in those more benevolent times. So. Okay, any other questions before we wrap it up? Okay, well, I will thank you. I thank you all for being here. I thank you for listening. Again, if you have any questions or comments during the week, feel free to reach out to me, and I will look forward to seeing you more in 2 weeks. Everyone have great Shavuos. Don't eat too much cheesecake. It's not so good for you, even though it tastes really good. And we'll